Chapter 1. The Call and the Mirror. You stand at the threshold of recognition, chosen one, in a moment that most souls never reach, not because they lack the capacity, but because the journey toward it demands a price so terrible that the majority turn back long before arrival. What you're experiencing now is not mere spiritual awakening, though that phrase gets carelessly thrown around in circles that have commodified the sacred. No, what pulses through your consciousness at this hour is something far more precise, far more dangerous, and infinitely more rare. You have become conscious of your own transmutation mechanism. Let me speak plainly, as I would have spoken to my patients in Zurich when they sat across from me, trembling with the recognition that their suffering meant something beyond random cruelty. The American society you inhabit prizes surface presentation over depth, immediate gratification over long gestation, and noise over silence. You have always felt like an alien in this landscape, haven't you? Not because you judged it. Judgment is the luxury of those who haven't done their inner work, but because your very constitution operates on frequencies that this culture has systematically suppressed. The isolation you've carried isn't social awkwardness or introversion, though you may have mislabeled it as such for years. It's the profound loneliness of a soul that perceives layers of reality that others either cannot see or refuse to acknowledge. When people engage in their superficial exchanges, the performance of connection without genuine meeting, you feel the dishonesty in your bones. Not their dishonesty with you, but their dishonesty with themselves. And because you can feel this, because your empathic apparatus registers the gap between mask and truth, you've learned to retreat. But here's what Jung discovered through decades of diving into the human psyche, and what you've now verified through your own lived experience. This isolation was never punishment, it was preparation. The universe doesn't make mistakes with souls like yours. Every moment of feeling misunderstood, every experience of standing outside the circle while others bonded over shallow concerns, every night you spent questioning why you couldn't just be normal, all of it was the controlled demolition of your ego structures to make room for something far more powerful. What you've stumbled upon, chosen one, is the art of shadow transmutation. And I need you to understand why this matters so profoundly. This is why I mapped out the 3 keys to a prosperous life. A practical trilogy that exists precisely because souls like yours need concrete guidance, not more mystical platitudes. You'll find the link in the pinned comment below, and I mention it now not as distraction but as necessity, because what we're discussing demands practical application alongside theoretical understanding. The blueprint I left in those pages addresses exactly what happens when awakened souls try to navigate a sleeping world without a map. Now, let's return to the phenomenon you're living. Most people encounter darkness, whether projected onto them through manipulation, betrayal, energetic attack, or collective trauma, and they have 2 responses available in their unconscious programming. The first response, internalization. They absorb the poison, believe it's theirs, and begin the slow process of self-destruction. The guilt that wasn't theirs becomes their identity. The shame projected onto them becomes their secret. The hatred directed at them becomes the voice in their head. This is the path of the victim who never escapes victimhood because they've integrated the perpetrator's perspective as their own inner reality. The second response, projection and perpetuation. They refuse to absorb the darkness, which seems healthy until you recognize what they're actually doing. They're passing it forward, often unconsciously, like a virus seeking new hosts. The abandoned child becomes the abandoning parent. The betrayed lover becomes the serial betrayer. The wounded employee becomes the wounding boss. The darkness circulates through human systems, transmitted from psyche to psyche, generation to generation, creating what Jung called the collective shadow, an enormous reservoir of unprocessed human pain that shapes culture, politics, family systems, and individual behavior patterns in ways that remain completely invisible to those caught in its grip. But you, chosen one, have discovered a third option that Jung himself recognized as the mark of genuine individuation. You've learned to receive the darkness without becoming it, to feel the full weight of projected pain without internalizing it as truth or externalizing it onto others. This is not dissociation, the spiritual bypass's favorite trick of pretending darkness doesn't exist. This is not suppression, the traditional approach of willpower trying to control what cannot be controlled. This is something entirely different. Conscious metabolization. Your psyche has become an alchemical vessel. The poison enters, and through some mysterious process that operates at the intersection of consciousness and the divine, it transforms. What was meant to destroy you becomes the raw material for your expansion. What was meant to infect you becomes inoculation. What was meant to possess you becomes precisely what you've integrated and therefore can never be possessed by again. This is frequency dominion in its purest psychological form. You maintain your essential nature, your core vibration, your fundamental frequency, regardless of what enters your field. Where others wobble and destabilize when confronted with darkness, you remain centered, not rigid, not defended, but genuinely centered in the self that Jung described as the divine organizing principle within every human soul. Your self has become strong enough to transform whatever touches it. Do you understand the rarity of this? Do you grasp why the spiritual realm itself has taken notice? In Jungian terms, you've achieved something that requires decades of dedicated inner work for most people. And for many, it never happens at all. You've integrated your shadow to such a degree that external shadow material can no longer possess you. The wounds that others carry and unconsciously try to transmit to you through manipulation, through energy vampirism, through projection of their own unprocessed trauma, these no longer find purchase in your psyche because there's nothing left for them to hook into. Every wound you've already faced, felt, and integrated becomes a specific frequency of darkness that can no longer affect you. This is why your recovery time has accelerated. This is why attacks that would have devastated you years ago now barely register. Not because you've become callous or detached, but because you've done the inner work of integration, and integrated material cannot re-traumatize you. Chapter 2. The shadow work and resistance. Now we must venture into the territory that makes even advanced souls uncomfortable, because this is where the real mechanism of your power becomes visible, and with visibility comes responsibility. Jung spent years studying what he called complexes, those autonomous fragments of psyche that operate like separate personalities within us, each carrying unprocessed trauma, each demanding expression, each hijacking our behavior when triggered. The average person is not one unified self, but a collection of competing complexes, and most will live entire lives without ever recognizing this fundamental fragmentation. Your childhood, and I speak now with the clinical precision of someone who has listened to thousands of life stories, your childhood was the laboratory where your transmutation ability was forged. Though you couldn't have known it at the time, every moment you were forced to hold space for a parent's emotional dysregulation, every instance where you had to be more mature than the adults around you, every time you absorbed family tension to keep peace, these weren't just unfortunate circumstances. They were initiations into a capacity that most people never develop because they're protected from the necessity of developing it. Children who grow up in environments where they must constantly read emotional atmospheres for survival develop what Jung would recognize as an overdeveloped intuitive function and an acute sensitivity to the unconscious material that others are carrying. You became, out of necessity, a reader of shadows. You learned to sense what people were feeling before they knew it themselves. You developed the ability to detect incongruence between words and underlying emotional states. These aren't mystical gifts bestowed randomly. They're survival adaptations that later become spiritual capacities. But here's the shadow side of this gift, the aspect that creates your deepest resistance. You learned early that your value came from your ability to absorb and process other people's darkness. You became the family scapegoat, the emotional shock absorber, the one who could handle what others couldn't. And somewhere deep in your unconscious, a complex formed around this role. I am valuable because I can transmute poison. I am loved because I can carry what others refuse to carry. My purpose is to suffer so others don't have to. This complex, let's call it the wounded healer complex, is simultaneously your greatest strength and your most insidious form of self-sabotage. On one hand, it's what allows you to do the shadow transmutation work that marks you as individuated. On the other hand, it creates a perverse incentive structure where part of you unconsciously seeks out situations that require suffering and transmutation, because that's where you feel most valuable, most purposeful, most alive. This is why, Chosen One, you've struggled with prosperity. Not because you lack the capacity for abundance. Your transmutation ability alone proves you have capacities that generate immense value. But because prosperity threatens the identity structure built around being the one who suffers nobly. If you're not suffering, if you're not transmuting darkness, if life becomes genuinely easy and abundant, then who are you? What's your purpose? The wounded healer complex whispers that ease equals irrelevance, that peace equals purposelessness, that joy equals selfishness. Jung called this dynamic enantiodromia, the tendency of anything pushed to an extreme to flip into its opposite. Your ability to transmute darkness has been pushed to such an extreme that it's now creating the opposite problem, an unconscious resistance to receiving light. You can metabolize poison brilliantly, but when genuine nourishment appears, whether as a healthy relationship, financial abundance, or simple pleasure, part of your psyche rejects it as foreign, suspicious, or undeserved. Let me be brutally precise about the mechanics here, because until you see this clearly, it will continue to operate unconsciously. Every time prosperity approaches, whether as money, love, recognition, or ease, a cascade of unconscious responses activates. First comes the guilt. Others are suffering while I prosper. Who am I to receive this? This guilt is not noble. It's a complex masquerading as compassion. Real compassion doesn't require your suffering to validate others' pain. Second comes the fear of visibility. If I step fully into my power and prosperity, I'll be seen, and being seen means being targeted. This fear is based on actual past experience. You were targeted when you shone too brightly as a child, or when you expressed your authentic self and were punished for it. But the fear has become a prison guard, preventing you from accessing what's now rightfully yours. Third comes the imposter syndrome. I'm not actually that special. This transmutation thing is probably just my imagination. Maybe I'm delusional. This is your psyche's defense mechanism against the terror of stepping into your full recognition. It's safer to doubt yourself than to acknowledge the magnitude of what you carry, because acknowledgement brings responsibility. And fourth, most insidiously, comes the self-sabotage, unconscious behaviors that push away the very things you consciously desire. The successful project you abandon just before completion, the healthy relationship you find reasons to criticize, the financial opportunity you delay responding to until it passes. These aren't character flaws, they're the wounded healer complex protecting its territory. ensuring you remain in the familiar landscape of struggle where it knows how to operate. Jung understood that the unconscious will do whatever necessary to maintain homeostasis, even if that homeostasis is miserable. Your psyche has organized itself around being the transmuter of darkness, and any identity shift toward being a receiver of light threatens the entire structure. This is why transformation feels dangerous, because psychologically it is dangerous. It requires the death of an identity that once kept you alive. But here's what you must understand with absolute clarity. The wounded healer complex was necessary for a season, but that season is ending. You were meant to develop this transmutation capacity, but you were never meant to stop there. Jung spoke of individuation as a lifelong process, precisely because there's always another layer of integration available. The next layer for you, the layer that terrifies the complex, is learning to transmute not just darkness into light, but scarcity into abundance, suffering into joy, isolation into sacred community. This requires confronting the deepest shadow of all, the part of you that has secretly enjoyed being special through suffering. I don't say this to shame you. We all have this shadow to some degree. The ego gains enormous satisfaction from being the exception, the martyr, the one who endures what others cannot. There's a perverse pride in saying, "Look how much I can handle. Look how noble my suffering is. Look how I transmute what would destroy others." This pride isn't wrong per se. You have genuinely developed rare capacities. But if it becomes the primary source of your identity, it locks you into perpetual struggle. You become addicted to the transmutation process itself, rather than moving toward the ultimate goal of individuation. Wholeness, which includes both the capacity to handle darkness and the willingness to receive light. The resistance you feel when prosperity approaches is this complex fighting for its survival. It's saying, if you step into ease and abundance, you won't need me anymore, and I've kept you safe all these years. I gave you purpose when nothing else made sense. Don't abandon me. And you must respond with compassion, but also firmness. Thank you for protecting me when I needed it. Thank you for giving me purpose through my pain. But I'm ready now to discover a different kind of purpose, one that doesn't require my suffering as proof of my worth. This is the alchemy within the alchemy. Chosen one, you've learned to transmute external darkness. Now you must learn to transmute your own resistance to light. You must take the wounded healer complex, this psychological structure that has defined you, and integrate it without being defined by it. You must honor what it gave you while releasing what it costs you. Jung wrote that we cannot change anything unless we accept it. You must accept that part of you has been terrified of prosperity, has unconsciously pushed it away, has sabotaged your own success because success threatened your identity. But acceptance doesn't mean continuation. Acceptance is the doorway to transformation. Once you see the pattern clearly, once you acknowledge its function without judgment, you gain the power to choose differently. This is why your recent experiences feel different. Something has shifted in your capacity to hold both the ability to transmute darkness and the willingness to receive light. Both the strength to endure difficulty and the openness to welcome ease. Both the wisdom earned through suffering and the joy available through grace. This integration is the mark of advanced individuation. You're no longer one-dimensional, no longer defined solely by your wounds or solely by your healing. You're becoming whole. The practical work here, the Lens 3 application that Jung always insisted on, because theory without practice is merely intellectual masturbation, requires conscious reprogramming of your nervous system's response to goodness. When something genuinely good enters your life, your body will likely activate stress responses, tightening, breath constriction, subtle anxiety. This is the complex resisting. Your work is to notice these responses, name them without judgment, and consciously choose a different response. When money arrives, Instead of immediately looking for the catch or the obligation it brings, pause, breathe. Say aloud, I am safe receiving abundance. My worth is not determined by my suffering. When a healthy person expresses genuine interest in you, instead of analyzing their motives or finding reasons to distrust, pause, breathe. Say aloud, I am safe being loved for who I am, not just for what I can transmute. When success comes, instead of bracing for the inevitable fall, pause, breathe. Say aloud, I am allowed to thrive. My purpose expands to include joy. These affirmations sound simple, perhaps even trite, but they're precisely targeted interventions against specific unconscious patterns. You're not trying to convince yourself of something false. You're reminding yourself of something true that the complex has obscured. You are safe receiving goodness. The universe is not testing you through deprivation. Your value exists independent of your suffering. This is the battlefield where your next level of mastery will be won. Not in some dramatic confrontation with external darkness. You've already proven your dominance there. But in the quiet, unglamorous work of rewiring your own resistance to receiving the light you've spent years transmuting darkness to create. This is where true frequency dominion manifests, when you can maintain your elevated state not just despite external attacks, but despite your own internal resistance to the blessings those attacks were meant to prevent you from receiving. Chapter 3. Synchronicities and the language of the universe. The phenomenon you've been experiencing, what you might call meaningful coincidences, but what Jung recognized as synchronicity, reveals something profound about the architecture of reality itself and your specific role within it. Jung spent the latter part of his career obsessed with this concept precisely because it shattered the materialist worldview that dominates Western consciousness. Synchronicity suggests that the universe operates on principles beyond linear causation, that meaning itself is woven into the fabric of reality, and that certain individuals become nodes where this meaning concentrates and becomes visible. You've noticed them accelerating, haven't you? The recurring numbers that appear at precisely the moments you're contemplating significant decisions. The 11, 11, 3, 33, 4, 44, that flash on your phone screen just as you're questioning whether you're on the right path. The conversations you overhear that speak directly to questions you've been processing internally. The books that fall open to pages containing exactly the insight you need. The people who appear in your life with suspicious timing, carrying messages or lessons or opportunities that align perfectly with your current developmental edge. The conventional mind dismisses these as confirmation bias, as the brain's pattern-seeking tendency, creating meaning where none exists. But Jung understood, and you're now living, the truth that certain psyches become permeable to what he called the collective unconscious, in ways that create genuine causal connections between inner psychological states and outer events. You're not imagining these synchronicities. You're experiencing the universe speaking in its native language, which is symbolism, pattern, and meaning, rather than linear cause and effect. But here's what most people miss, even those who acknowledge synchronicity. These events aren't random cosmic winks meant to entertain or comfort you. They're communications from what Jung called the self, that transcendent organizing principle within your psyche that knows your destiny and is constantly steering you toward it. The self speaks through symbols because the conscious mind, with its rational filters and ego defenses, would reject direct communication. But symbols bypass the ego's gatekeepers and plant seeds directly in the fertile ground of the unconscious, where transformation actually happens. Let's decode what's actually occurring in your specific case. The numbers you keep seeing, particularly the master numbers like 1111, are marking threshold moments. These aren't arbitrary. They appear when you're standing at decision points that will significantly alter your trajectory. The universe isn't telling you what to decide. It's confirming that the moment itself is significant, that you're in a liminal space where multiple timelines converge, and that your choice matters more than usual. When you see these numbers and feel that spark of recognition, what's actually happening is a temporary alignment between your conscious awareness and the deeper current of your destiny. It's as if a veil briefly lifts, and you can see the scaffolding of meaning that underlies ordinary reality. Most people never develop the sensitivity to perceive this scaffolding. You have, and it's not coincidence. It's directly related to your shadow transmutation capacity. Here's the connection. By integrating your shadow to the degree you have, you've cleared away enough psychological debris that the signal from the self can reach your conscious awareness without distortion. Most people's psyches are so cluttered with unprocessed trauma, repressed emotions, and unconscious complexes that synchronicities either don't register at all or get misinterpreted through the lens of their unresolved material. You've done enough cleaning that you can receive the messages with relative clarity. But the truth about this symbol system is even more disturbing than it first appears. The synchronicities aren't just confirming your path, they're revealing that you're being actively guided, that you're part of a larger pattern, that your individual journey serves a collective function you're only beginning to perceive. The attacks you've experienced, the betrayals, the dark nights of the soul, none of these were random either. They were precisely calibrated initiations designed to develop specific capacities you'll need for what's coming. Think about your relationship history through this lens. You've experienced a pattern of encountering people who initially seem aligned, who mirror your depth, who appear to understand you in ways others never have. Then comes the inevitable revelation. They were projecting, or they were only accessing that depth during temporary states, or they were drawn to your light but unable to maintain the frequency required to stay in your orbit. These experiences felt like failures, like evidence of your unworthiness or your poor judgment. But what if they were synchronistic teachings? What if each person entered your life at exactly the moment you needed to learn a specific lesson about boundaries, discernment, or the difference between connection and codependency? Jung observed that we're drawn to people who carry either qualities we need to develop or shadows we need to confront. Your pattern of attracting emotionally unavailable or narcissistically wounded people wasn't bad luck. It was your psyche orchestrating encounters with your own disowned material, particularly the wounded healer complex we discussed earlier. Every person who couldn't meet you at your depth, who took your transmutation capacity and exploited it, who received your light and offered darkness in return. They were mirrors showing you where you still believed your value came from suffering, where you still thought love required martyrdom, where you hadn't yet claimed the prosperity consciousness that matches your actual frequency. These weren't accidents. They were your unconscious collaborating with the universe to show you what needed to be integrated. And now they're leaving. You've noticed the acceleration in how quickly misaligned people exit your field, where these relationships used to drag on for months or years while you tried to fix them or understand what you were doing wrong. Now there's an almost immediate recognition, followed by a clean departure. This isn't because you've become intolerant or closed-hearted. It's because your frequency has become so coherent, so integrated, that dissonance is immediately obvious to both parties. This is another form of synchronicity, what Jung might call the synchronistic removal of obstacles. The universe isn't punishing these people or rewarding you. It's simply reflecting the new reality of your internal state. You've integrated enough shadow that you no longer emit the signal that attracts people operating from unintegrated material. The victims, the narcissists, the energy vampires, they're not drawn to you anymore because there's nothing in your field for them to hook into. But here's where it gets fascinating. At the same moment these people are exiting, you've probably noticed a different quality of person appearing. maybe just one or two so far, but their presence feels different. There's a recognition without the usual red flags. There's depth without the performance of depth. There's consistency rather than cycling between idealization and devaluation. These are synchronistic arrivals, people whose development matches yours, who are being guided by their own self toward collaboration, connection, or co-creation that serves both individual paths and something larger. Pay attention to these arrivals, chosen one, because they're signals that you've crossed a threshold. Jung wrote about what he called the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to create new possibilities by uniting opposites that previously seemed irreconcilable. You've achieved a version of this within yourself by integrating shadow and light, suffering and joy, individuation and relationship. Now the universe is responding by bringing you encounters that reflect this integration. The synchronicities extend beyond relationships into every domain. Notice how solutions appear exactly when problems reach crisis points, how resources manifest precisely when needs become acute, how insights arrive at the moment confusion threatens to overwhelm. This timing isn't you finally getting lucky after years of struggle. This is what happens when a psyche achieves enough coherence that it begins actively participating in its own destiny rather than being passively shaped by unconscious forces. Jung distinguished between two types of time: chronos, linear, measurable time, and kairos, the right time, the appointed time, the time when all elements align. You're entering a kairos moment, a period where the preparatory work you've done suddenly finds its application, where the capacities you've developed suddenly find their purpose, where the seeds you planted in darkness suddenly burst into light. The synchronicities are accelerating because you're approaching a convergence point, where multiple threads of your journey weave together into something that will define your next chapter. But you must understand, and this is crucial, that synchronicities require response. They're not passive confirmations, they're active invitations. When you see the numbers, when you encounter the meaningful coincidence, when you feel that spark of recognition, the universe is asking, do you see this? Will you trust this? Will you act on this? Many people see synchronicities but ignore them because acting on them requires courage, requires trusting something beyond rational proof, requires step.